September 13th, 1847. Chapultepec Castle rises from volcanic rock above Mexico City like a crown on a dying king's head. 800 Mexican cadets and a handful of regular troops face 7,000 American soldiers climbing the steep approaches below. The morning mist carries the sound of boots on stone and the rattle of scaling ladders against ancient walls. But this is not a story of swift conquest. This is the story of how boys became legends, how a military defeat became a moral victory that would echo through generations of Mexican memory. To understand why these young men chose to fight rather than flee, you must know that General Winfield Scott's army had already shattered every organized Mexican force between the coast and the capital. The war was effectively over. Chapultepec was the last fortress defending Mexico City, and the Colegio Militar housed teenage cadets who had been ordered to evacuate. Most obeyed. Some did not. Those who remained would transform a hopeless last stand into the founding myth of modern Mexican courage. The Mexican-American War had begun with border disputes and manifest destiny rhetoric, but by September 1847 it had become a systematic dismantling of Mexican resistance. General Winfield Scott's campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City read like a military textbook. Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco. Each battle ended the same way. Mexican forces fought bravely, then broke under superior American artillery and discipline. But the legend of Chapultepec tells a different story. It speaks of 6 heroic boy cadets who chose death over surrender, who wrapped themselves in Mexican flags and leaped from the castle walls rather than face capture. The truth walks on more complicated ground. Modern historians count closer to 50 cadets who remained at their posts, not 6. Their ages ranged from 13 to 19, some barely old enough to shave. They were students at the Colegio Militar, Mexico's premier military academy, housed within the stone walls of Chapultepec Castle since 1843. Most came from middle-class families who had scraped together tuition for their sons to gain officer commissions in the Mexican army. The castle itself commanded the western approaches to Mexico City from a hill 200 feet above the surrounding lakes and marshes. Built as a viceregal summer palace, its thick walls and elevated position made it a natural fortress. Control Chapultepec, and you controlled the causeway into the heart of Mexico's capital. General Nicholas Bravo commanded the garrison with about 1,000 men, including regular infantry, artillery crews, and the military college cadets. When Scott's forces approached, Mexican authorities ordered the evacuation of non-essential personnel. The cadets were specifically instructed to leave. Then came the choice that would define the legend. Some cadets obeyed orders and departed for safety. Others chose to stay and fight alongside the regulars, knowing the odds, knowing the likely outcome, knowing they might never see their families again. Chapultepec Castle perched on its rocky hill like a stone ship sailing above a green sea of cypress trees. The Bosque de Chapultepec stretched below, its ancient groves hiding the approaches that American engineers were already mapping. From the castle's eastern terraces, you could see the spires of Mexico City's cathedral, catching the morning light just 2 miles away. The fortress itself was a maze of courtyards and corridors built for comfort, not war. Viceroys had once strolled these halls planning garden parties and diplomatic receptions. The military college had adapted the elegant rooms into classrooms, barracks, and armories, but the palace bones still showed. Grand staircases and decorative balconies made poor defensive positions. The cadets who remained knew every corner of this place. They had polished floors in these halls, studied mathematics and military engineering in these rooms, drilled with muskets in these courtyards. Juan de la Barrera, 19 years old and the senior cadet, had spent 4 years here. Fernando Montes de Oca was barely 14, small enough to squeeze through windows that older boys could not fit. General Bravo positioned his regular troops at the outer works, earthen fortifications that ringed the hill's base. The cadets would serve as a reserve, helping to man the artillery pieces mounted on the castle's upper terraces. Most carried older smoothbore muskets, single-shot weapons that required careful loading and steady nerves. Ammunition was limited. Food was running low. Medical supplies filled one small room, But if the defenders were few and poorly equipped, their position remained formidable. The hill's steep slopes channeled any assault into predictable killing zones. Stone walls 18 inches thick could absorb considerable punishment. The elevation gave Mexican gunners clear fields of fire across the approaches. The question that would haunt the coming battle was simple. Could terrain and courage overcome numbers and artillery? The American army climbing toward Chapultepec was about to provide the answer. General Winfield Scott had earned his reputation through methodical precision, not reckless heroics. At 61, he commanded the most professional army the United States had ever fielded. His veterans had learned their trade in the swamps of Florida and perfected it on the volcanic slopes of central Mexico. They called him Old Fuss and Feathers for his attention to uniform details, but they followed him because his plans worked. The American approach to Chapultepec reflected Scott's systematic mind. He positioned his artillery on the surrounding hills, creating overlapping fields of fire that could pound the castle from multiple angles. The heavy siege guns had been dragged over mountain passes and through jungle mud for this moment. Each 12-pound shot could crack stone walls. Each howitzer shell could clear a courtyard of defenders. But Scott faced his own constraints. His army, though veteran and well-equipped, was operating at the end of a supply line that stretched back to the Gulf of Mexico. Every day in the field meant more sick soldiers, more ammunition consumed, more pressure from Washington to finish the war. Mexico City lay just beyond Chapultepec, and with it the political victory that would justify 2 years of fighting. The assault plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. General John Quitman's division would strike from the south, climbing the steep paths through the cypress groves. General Gideon Pillow's men would approach from the west, where the slopes were gentler but the defensive work stronger. Supporting artillery would maintain constant bombardment to suppress Mexican return fire. Time worked against the defenders in ways that numbers alone could not measure. Each passing hour brought fresh American reinforcements forward, more ammunition to the gun positions, more ladders and scaling equipment to the assault columns. The ring around Chapultepec tightened like a noose, methodical and patient. From the castle walls, the cadets could see enemy campfires spreading across the valley floor like fallen stars. They counted the gun flashes during the preliminary bombardments and felt the ancient stones shudder with each impact. The war was coming to them, carried on the shoulders of 7,000 soldiers who had already proven they knew how to take fortified positions. The siege of Chapultepec would not be a long affair. Scott's army was too experienced, too well supplied, and too determined to let a hilltop castle delay their march into Mexico City. September 12th dawned clear and still. The cypress trees around Chapultepec stood motionless in the windless air, their branches heavy with morning dew. Then the American guns opened fire. The first salvo hit the castle's eastern wall like a hammer blow against an anvil. Limestone blocks older than the United States cracked and tumbled into the courtyards below. The sound rolled across the valley, a deep bass note that rattled windows in Mexico City 2 miles away. Birds rose from the Bosque de Chapultepec in panicked clouds, wheeling against the blue sky before disappearing toward the distant mountains. The bombardment settled into a steady rhythm. Every few minutes, another crash, another shower of stone dust, another section of wall weakened or destroyed. The American gunners worked with professional efficiency, adjusting their aim based on the fall of shot, concentrating fire on the most vulnerable points. They had done this before at Veracruz, at Cerro Gordo, at every fortress that had tried to bar their path. Inside the castle, the cadets crouched in corridors and pressed themselves against interior walls that offered protection from the flying debris. The younger boys flinched with each impact. The older, ones tried to project calm they did not feel. Plaster rained from ceilings. Windows shattered. The elegant rooms where they had studied military theory were becoming rubble-strewn ruins. General Bravo moved among his men, checking positions, offering encouragement, calculating how long the walls could withstand this punishment. His artillery crews returned fire when they could, but the American guns outnumbered Mexican pieces 10-1. Each Mexican shot drew immediate counter-battery fire that silenced the position or killed the crew. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. This was not the chaos of battlefield combat where adrenaline could mask fear. This was methodical destruction, patient and unstoppable. The defenders could only endure it, count the hits, and wonder when the infantry assault would follow. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battered castle, the American bombardment continued without pause. The message was clear. Tomorrow would bring the final attack. Dawn on September 13th brought no relief. The American artillery resumed its work with the first light, methodically widening the gaps torn in Chapultepec's walls the day before. But now the guns fell silent at precise intervals, allowing assault columns to dash forward across the broken ground. The cypress groves that had once sheltered picnicking families now crawled with blue uniformed soldiers. They moved in short rushes, using tree trunks and fallen logs for cover, carrying scaling ladders and fascines to fill the defensive ditches. The morning air filled with the crack of musket fire as Mexican defenders tried to pick off the advancing Americans. General Quitman's men found the first breakthrough along the southern approach. A night of concentrated bombardment had collapsed an entire section of the outer earthworks, creating a slope of rubble that determined soldiers could climb. The breach was narrow, perhaps 20 feet wide, but it offered a path up the hill that bypassed the strongest defensive positions. The first Americans through the gap were New York volunteers, men who had learned urban fighting in the slums of Manhattan and applied those lessons to the streets of Mexico City's suburbs. They scrambled up the debris slope under heavy fire, each man knowing that hesitation meant death in the killing zone below. Mexican defenders rushed to plug the breach. Cadets who had been held in reserve now found themselves in desperate hand-to-hand combat among the broken stones. Juan Escutia, barely 17 years old, helped drag a cannon into position to sweep the gap with grape shot. The gun fired twice before American marksmen picked off the crew. But one breach became two, then three. The sustained bombardment had weakened the defensive line at multiple points. American engineers had studied the castle for weeks, mapping every wall, every angle, every potential weakness. Now that knowledge paid dividends in blood and broken stone. From the castle's upper terraces, the remaining defenders could see enemy soldiers spreading across the lower slopes like blue ants swarming a hill. The outer defenses were crumbling. The fight was moving up toward the military college itself, where teenage boys waited with single-shot muskets and whatever courage they could summon. The walls that had protected viceroys for generations were failing. The real battle was about to begin. The fighting reached the castle's main entrance as church bells across Mexico City chimed 9 o'clock. American soldiers poured through the shattered gates and up the grand staircase where cadets had once marched to morning formation. Now those same steps ran red with blood from both sides. The military college became a maze of desperate encounters. In the mathematics classroom, Cadet Agustin Melgar made his final stand behind overturned desks, firing his musket until American bayonets found him. The library where young men had studied the campaigns of Napoleon became a battlefield where books provided the only cover from flying bullets. Room by room, the defenders fell back toward the castle's heart. The Americans advanced with grim efficiency, their experience showing in every movement. They cleared each corridor methodically, using grenades to flush out hidden defenders, coordinating their assault with practiced precision. Fernando Montes de Oca, the youngest defender at 14, helped carry wounded men to the makeshift hospital in what had been the commandant's dining room. The boy was too small to handle the heavy muskets effectively, but he could reload weapons for older cadets and drag ammunition boxes across the rubble-strewn floors. The Mexican flag still flew from the castle's highest tower, but American soldiers were already climbing the interior stairs to reach it. General Bravo had been wounded and captured. Most of his regular troops were dead or scattered. The defense now rested with a handful of teenage boys who refused to surrender. First, the armory fell, then the barracks, then the chapel where the cadets had prayed before battle. The Americans pressed forward with the momentum of inevitable victory, knowing the castle was theirs, knowing the war was nearly over. Finally came the moment when resistance became impossible. The remaining cadets faced a simple choice: surrender and live as prisoners, or make one last gesture of defiance that would accomplish nothing except to prove that courage sometimes matters more than victory. Some chose surrender. Others chose legend. The last Mexican defenders gathered in the castle's highest rooms as American voices echoed from the corridors below. 6 young men remained: Juan Escutia, Juan de la Barrera, Agustin Melgar, Fernando Montes de Oca, Vicente Suarez, and Francisco Marquez. Their ages spanned from 14 to 19. Their ammunition was exhausted. Their escape routes were cut. Through the shattered windows, they could see American soldiers hauling down the Mexican flag from the outer ramparts. The stars and stripes would soon fly over Chapultepec Castle. Mexico City's cathedral bells had fallen silent. Even the sounds of battle were fading as the last pockets of resistance were eliminated. Juan de la Barrera, the senior cadet, faced the hardest choice. At 19, he understood military realities better than the younger boys. Surrender was not dishonor when further resistance served no tactical purpose. His instructors had taught him that a good officer preserves his men's lives when the battle is lost. Capture meant prison camps, not execution. But something else weighed in the balance. These boys had grown up hearing stories of Mexico's heroes, men who had died fighting Spanish colonial rule, leaders who had chosen death over submission to foreign conquest. The American invasion had swept aside every organized Mexican force. If the last defenders of the last fortress simply raised white flags, what would that say about their nation's spirit? The choice was individual and personal. Some cadets laid down their weapons and walked toward the American soldiers with raised hands. No shame attached to survival. They had fought bravely against impossible odds. Others made different calculations. They were not fighting for military victory anymore. They were fighting for something that would outlive the battle, something that would matter when the war became memory and memory became legend. In those final moments, as American boots thundered up the staircases and surrender beckoned like common sense, 6 young men chose to transform defeat into mythology. They wrapped themselves in the Mexican flag and walked toward windows that opened onto empty air. They were not dying for conquest or territory or political advantage. They were dying so that their people would remember that some things matter more than living. The American flag rose over Chapultepec Castle at 9:30 in the morning. General Quitman's men secured the ramparts while engineers surveyed the damage from 2 days of bombardment. The fortress that had guarded Mexico City for generations was now an American stronghold, its broken walls testifying to the power of modern artillery and disciplined assault. Victory had come at a price. American casualties numbered in the hundreds, with entire companies shattered against the castle's defenses. The New York volunteers who had led the final assault counted their survivors on bloodied fingers. Officers who had survived every battle from Veracruz to the Capitol gates now lay still among the cypress trees. But the Mexican cost was absolute. The Colegio Militar existed no more. Its students were dead, captured, or scattered to the winds. The elegant halls where young men had studied engineering and mathematics were ruins filled with rubble and the smell of gunpowder. Books lay torn and scattered, their pages mixing with broken glass and shattered stone. General Winfield, Scott climbed the castle steps that afternoon to survey his prize. The old soldier had won many battles, but victory at Chapultepec felt different. The defenders had fought with a desperation that went beyond military duty. They had died for something that transcended tactics and strategy, something that made even veteran soldiers uncomfortable with their triumph. The bodies of the 6 cadets were found where they had fallen, still wrapped in fragments of the Mexican flag. American officers ordered them buried with military honors, recognizing courage even in defeat. The gesture was practical as well as respectful. Mexico City still lay ahead, and Scott needed Mexican civilians to see Americans as liberators, not conquerors. But the legend had already begun to grow. Mexican survivors whispered stories of the boy heroes who had chosen death over surrender. The tales spread through the capital's streets like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each telling. Defeat was being transformed into moral victory, military failure into spiritual triumph. Victory arrived limping for the Americans. They had won the castle, the battle, and soon the war. But something else had been won that day. Something that belonged to the defeated and would prove more durable than any military conquest. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War 6 months later, but the story of Chapultepec had already begun its transformation from military defeat to national mythology. In cantinas and marketplaces across Mexico, people spoke of the Niños Héroes, the boy heroes who had chosen death over dishonor. The legend grew with each telling. 6 became the sacred number, though historians would later count more cadets among the defenders. Their ages shrank in popular memory until they became children, not teenagers. Their final moments became increasingly dramatic, with tales of boys leaping from the castle walls rather than face capture, their bodies wrapped in the Mexican flag like burial shrouds. These embellishments served a deeper truth. Mexico had lost the war, lost half its territory, lost its status as a major power. The nation needed heroes who had not been defeated, examples of courage that could not be conquered by superior numbers or better artillery. The cadets of Chapultepec provided exactly that inspiration. Mexican writers and artists seized upon the story. Poems celebrated the boy martyrs who had died for La Patria. Paintings showed them in their final moments, young faces set with determination as they chose honor over life. The Mexican flag they had died defending became a sacred symbol, proof that some values transcended military victory or political success. But the legend also answered practical questions about national identity. If Mexico could produce such heroes, if teenagers could show such courage against impossible odds, then the nation retained its essential spirit despite military defeat. The conquest of territory did not mean conquest of the soul. This did not end American expansion, but it ended the idea that Mexicans would accept foreign domination without resistance. The memory of Chapultepec became a rallying cry for future generations, a reminder that courage could triumph over circumstance even in defeat. The 6 boy heroes had accomplished something that no military victory could match. They had given their defeated nation a reason to believe in itself again. A monument stands today in Mexico City's Chapultepec Park, 6 marble columns rising from manicured gardens where cypress trees once sheltered the approaches to the castle. Each column bears the name of a Niño Héroe: Juan Escutilla, Juan de la Barrera, Agustín Melgar, Fernando Montes de Oca, Vicente Suárez, Francisco Marquez. School children visit on field trips, laying flowers at the base while teachers recount the story of September 13, 1847. The castle itself has become the National Museum of History, its restored halls filled with artifacts from Mexico's past. Visitors can walk the same corridors where teenage cadets made their final stand, though elegant displays have replaced the rubble and bloodstains of that distant morning. The Mexican flag flies from the same tower where American soldiers once raised the stars and stripes in victory. Every September 13th, Mexico honors the Niños Héroes with official ceremonies and military parades. Presidents lay wreaths while honor guards fire ceremonial volleys. The story has become part of the national curriculum, taught to generations of children as a lesson in patriotism and sacrifice. The 6 have joined the pantheon of Mexican heroes alongside Hidalgo, Morelos, and Juarez. But the legend extends beyond official commemoration. Street names across Mexico recall the boy heroes. Neighborhoods bear their memory. The story appears in murals, songs, and popular culture. Each retelling reinforces the central message that courage matters more than victory, that moral triumph can emerge from military defeat. The echo of Chapultepec shaped Mexico's response to future challenges. When French armies occupied the country 20 years later, resistance fighters invoked the memory of the cadets. When revolution convulsed the nation in 1910, both sides claimed the legacy of the boy heroes who had died for Mexican independence. A bell rings each evening at Chapultepec Castle, calling visitors to remember the young men who chose legend over life. It is a memory that refuses to fade, a sound that carries across the centuries like an eternal promise that some things matter more than winning or losing.